You're about to witness a terrible story. And as you do, keep this in mind. It could be your story. In 1977, a KLM plane crashed into a Pan Am aircraft. The KLM burst into flames immediately, drawing rescue crews to it, and consequently, leaving the Pan Am on its own. The passengers on the Pan Am faced spreading flames and smoke, but some stayed right where they were, as if in a dazed stupor. They had 1 minute to escape the plane before its fuel tank would explode. Floy, a passenger on the Pan Am, recalled sitting in a frozen haze. Her husband had to scream for her to follow him, which she did blindly, not registering what was happening. As they left, Floy saw her friend still in her seat, glassy-eyed, with her hands folded in her lap. Of the 396 people aboard the Pan Am, 330 died like Floy's friend, sitting stock still in the face of avoidable death. The 61 survivors included passengers who were also on the plane, just lucky enough to be sitting far enough away from the explosion. The Pan Am passengers were regular people. Indeed, psychologist John Leach reports that when meeting disaster, only 10 to 15% will respond efficiently, while 70% of people will freeze. The remaining people freak out, a response, but an ineffective one. Those 10 to 15% who respond efficiently usually have a reason behind their efficacy, such as being trained to handle emergencies. In Paul Heck's case, he had been in a theater fire as a child and made a habit of noting emergency exits everywhere he went. That means the average person, you most likely, though you won't want to believe it, will almost certainly be one of the 70% who freeze. There's a reason behind freezing too: the normalcy bias. Meet normalcy bias. In essence, normalcy bias is our tendency to underestimate, dismiss, or deny deviations from the status quo. Normalcy bias is what detaches us from other people's misfortunes. We can't comprehend a future where such misfortune happens to our own selves. We feel that we're the exception to the rule. Surely, our lives will continue on normally, as they always have. Nothing out of the ordinary will ever happen. Unexpected changes are, well, unexpected. The famous cartoon Calvin and Hobbes may have put it best. After their house is burgled, the parents have a conversation that goes like so. This is one of those things you always figure will happen to someone else. Unfortunately, we are all someone else to someone else. And normalcy bias is what keeps people frozen when planes are about to explode. When you're faced with an overwhelming disaster, your brain will try to handle it by throwing a rug over it. Everything is normal. This situation is normal. No need to panic. This too is well illustrated by a popular cartoon. The extremely relatable, googly-eyed dog sitting at a kitchen table declaring, "This is fine," while the kitchen is engulfed in flames. As with all psychological phenomena, there are many complicated factors causing this bias, as well as many complicated effects. The effects are easier to delineate, so we'll start with that. In the days leading up to August 24th, 79 CE, the 10 or 20,000 citizens of Pompeii had experienced small, increasingly frequent earthquakes. But such tremors were common in the region, and no one was concerned. And then, Mount Vesuvius erupted. The volcano spewed a dark cloud of ash miles into the air, shrouding the sky. Engulfed in darkness, with molten rock and pumice raining down upon them, some of the Pompeians chose to stay in their homes, hoping to ride it out. They were buried under volcanic debris. Meanwhile, a smaller town, located even closer to the volcano than Pompeii, was safe from the first eruption. Many, having witnessed the destruction of Pompeii, fled. But still, some chose to stay, and they were burned alive in a surge of superheated poisoned gas. Normalcy bias? Sure. But it seems like those who stayed only represent a minority of people from 2,000 years ago. Today, you might say we're smarter, more advanced. We recognize warnings, predict disasters before they happen, evacuate in time. And then thousands of people, despite warnings of catastrophe and forecasted damage, didn't evacuate New Orleans when Hurricane Katrina hit. Normalcy bias doesn't just run rampant when it comes to natural disasters. Look at the 2020 pandemic. We probably all know someone who laughed at the idea of wearing masks or staying at home. A friend told me that she expected the lockdown to be over in a week. And the bias wasn't just longing for normal once normal was gone. Decades before 2020, disease experts warned that a pandemic would come, and the world was unprepared. But instead of preparing itself, the world chose to go on its merry way, as if normal would continue forever. The same thing is happening with climate change. In 2019, more than 11,000 scientists joined to declare that Earth was facing an urgent climate emergency. If nothing changed, humans would see Armageddon, droughts, floods, wildfires, mass extinctions, but very little has changed. Normalcy bias makes us ignore issues, even those staring us right in the face. When something less tangible, like climate change currently, is a threat, it's even more tantalizingly easy to ignore. But normalcy bias doesn't just show up in extreme cases like exploding planes, erupting volcanoes, or environmental crises where lives are at stake. Less famous than its paralyzing effect during disasters is how normalcy bias affects your everyday life. But affect your everyday life it does. Here, normalcy bias manifests as an inability to adapt to changing times. This has quite a few implications for anyone who's looking to be successful in life. Consider, for example, how the digital revolution has taken over our lives. Someone affected by normalcy bias might refuse to create an online presence for their business, thinking good old word of mouth and antiquated methods of advertisement will be enough. In this day and age, that's pretty much a death sentence. Companies affected by normalcy bias don't have a chance of surviving. Blockbuster, thinking their golden age would continue forever, scorned Netflix and went bankrupt. When America's Great Depression hit, Post cereals, have you ever heard of them? Carried on business as usual, while Kellogg, pretty sure you've heard of them, doubled down on marketing efforts. Kellogg, of course, now leads the cereal industry. You can probably think of more ways that you see normalcy bias on a daily basis. Whenever you shy away from worrying, whenever you feel your brain urging you towards what's easy, that's normalcy bias. It's so problematic. Why does normalcy bias even exist? The short answer? It's complicated. The long answer? It depends on the situation. In cases like the Pan Am explosion, where people became completely immobilized, shock could certainly play a factor. In cases involving a lot of people, like the pandemic, we might bounce off each other's opinions. Do I panic? No one else is panicking, so everything is fine. In the pandemic's case, we switch to, now everyone is panicking, time to panic. In cases that seem far away, like climate change, it might just seem too inconvenient to worry about. One commonly offered reason that can apply to every case is that your brain wants the path of least resistance. It doesn't want to accept a bad, difficult, stressful, etc., abnormal reality, so it frames things as normal. You're not aware of your brain doing this, of course. A possible reason for the normalcy bias that you might be more aware of is social pressure. Society in general isn't fond of scaremongers and pessimists, probably because society in general is afflicted with a bad case of normalcy bias. And there is some legitimacy to this. Unfounded mass hysteria can be just as problematic as the effects of normalcy bias. Just remember the panic buying from earlier on in the pandemic. No one cares for needless worrying and panicking, and no one wants to cause needless worrying and panicking, or alternatively, become a laughingstock because everyone else thinks their fears are ludicrous. It might seem like there's no winning. Let normalcy bias affect your life, or have others see you as a doomsayer. But you can win. The key is to strike a balance. Becoming informed about a bias is the first step in defeating it. This rule holds true for the normalcy bias, so congratulations, you've already completed the most important part. Now that you're aware of normalcy bias's existence, you'll be better at noticing when it happens to you. And once you notice those subconscious workings of your brain, you can consciously fight them. What happens then, though? If you respond to every, "this is okay, this is normal," with, "this is danger, sound the alarms," you'll quickly be branded as a no-good alarmist. You might even switch to the opposite of normalcy bias, which goes by many names: overreaction bias, worst-case scenario bias, but is essentially paranoia. You could just live by better safe than sorry, stop caring what other people think, and err on the side of caution. That's valid, but there's a way to have your cake and eat it too. Use the facts. Use logical, rational thinking. It's really that simple. Our brains are full of biases that cause us to act and think in irrational ways. Once those biases are recognized, you can override them with logic. In response to the normalcy bias that caused people to dismiss pandemic with "more people die of the flu every year," you could easily point out that those flu death statistics are for a whole year, while the pandemic was still playing out. The virus hadn't existed for that long yet. If you were willing to do a little research, you could also mention that this virus is significantly more infectious than the flu, and the exponential growth of cases would soon kick in. At the same time, in response to the overreaction bias of the panic buyers, you could reason that you don't suddenly need a surplus of groceries just because everyone else is snapping them up. The amount of supplies you need stays the same. You can take what you need and you'll be fine. These hypothetical scenarios show the power of simple, fact-based logic. This is how you avoid extremes, saying everything is fine when the world's on fire, or screaming that the world's on fire when everything is fine. Defeating biases, normal or otherwise, won't always be a walk in the park. If it was so easy, the biases wouldn't exist in the first place. There's something visceral about them. The trick is to notice and acknowledge your feelings, however irrational they might be, and then set them aside. When it comes to the intersection of normalcy bias and survival, it's good to be ready. But paying attention to emergency exits like Paul Heck doesn't mean you have to be anxious about your flight crashing. Just be prepared. Having a plan in case of a hurricane doesn't mean you have to hoard loads of supplies in your basement, just a reasonable amount. In short, to break away from normalcy bias in any scenario, use caution, but be cautious about the amount of caution you're using. Facts and logic are your friends. There's a reason that Pompeii, the song by Bastille, not the city destroyed by Mount Vesuvius, although the former was written about the latter, is so popular. Its lyrics, the idea of closing your eyes and feeling like nothing's changed at all as the walls keep tumbling down and gray clouds bring darkness from above, are undeniably alluring. We listeners are drawn to it. We long for a world where nothing has changed. That's the strength of the normalcy bias. But if you close your eyes, you run the risk of getting into hot water, whether it's your success or your life that's endangered. Luckily for you, you now have the power to open your eyes to normalcy bias and stand up against it. You know it exists and why it exists. You know the detrimental effects it can have, and you know how to escape it. This information is all in your hands, and now it's up to you to do something about it. Thanks for watching. I would like to hear what you guys have to say in the comments section. Hope you had a great time and enjoy the rest of your day.